Hello and welcome to the show. Today I am on Forza 5 investigating the age-old question of Turbocharger versus Supercharger. Now, when you come to building up a car on this game, if you are going for the maximum power, like I did with the silly car builds, if I'm trying to get the absolute maximum out of the engine, Turbocharger is your better option. There is no doubt about that. The turbos are going to get more power than a Supercharger. However, if you are building up a car to a specific class, you are not necessarily looking to get the absolute maximum power out of an engine. You're looking to get as much power out of the car as you can, but staying within the set class, whether it be C class, B class, A class, and so on and so forth. So what is the better option to go for? I'm loving how much the yellow birds lift its front wheels up through the corners. Yeah, so what is your better option to go for if you want to put some forced induction on your car? I'm going to start with a very brief explanation of how these things work. If you want to get a more detailed one, I'm sure you can find somewhere something that has a lot more knowledge than I do on these. But basically, both of these are about getting as much air into the engine as possible. They go about it slightly different ways. The more air you can get into the engine, I think the more fuel you can put in, the more power you can get out. It's a very simplified version of what you're trying to do. Now, a turbo works by taking the exhaust gases. As they exit the engine, they exit very fast, and it runs them through a turbine that spins the thing and pulls air into the engine. It's good because the exhaust gases are coming out of the engine regardless. They're coming out the back of the engine, so you might as well make use of it. The downsides to a turbo are that if you're in the wrong gear at the wrong time, you get absolutely zero power because the exhaust gases aren't exiting at a fast enough speed for anything to happen. But we are talking about a racing game here. You're on racetracks. You're not really going to be in the wrong gear at the wrong time very often when it comes to racing on a circuit. So you can feel it on Forza 5 with some of the cars if you really mess up your gearing, if you're in the wrong gear leaving a corner, but it's not as huge a concern. When it comes to a Supercharger, again, it's doing the same thing, trying to get more air into the engine. However, it's run directly off the engine. It doesn't bother with the exhaust gases, it's run directly off the engine itself, which means it drains some power to run it. Yes, you get more power out of it in the end than you use up, of course, otherwise why on earth would you ever have it? But it drains some power off the engine, which means that you never get as much power out of a Supercharger, which is why when I max the cars out, I'm always using a turbo. It's also not quite as popular. It's certainly when I was picking a car to do this little demonstration bit, there was not really much to choose from that was supercharged, most of them being Fords and Ford Mustangs and there's a couple of Chevrolets. There wasn't a huge choice for the Supercharger when there was plenty of cars I could have used for turbo. But that's basically how the two things work. And yeah, the plus side of a Supercharger is that you don't get any lag with it at all because it's always going. Anyway, I set up a little experiment to try and answer this question. I had 6 sets of cars. Starting off with a Ferrari Testarossa. Now, there were 2 cars. The red car in this scenario is turbocharged, the blue car is supercharged. Now, the cars were built exactly the same in regards to handling parts. So they all had race tyres, brakes, suspension, weight reduction, and so on. With all the handling parts were kept exactly the same between the 2 cars. It was then for me to change the... I mean, if you're building a car for a racing as well, you're going to have a lot of handling parts on it. So, yeah, that's part of the reason why I did it. And then it was to change the aspiration. So one of the cars would have a turbocharger, the other car would have a supercharger, and then they were built up to the top of whatever class that it seemed right for them. So in the case of the Ferrari here, it was to A class. Now, the supercharger component and turbocharger component were both maxed to the maximum option that I had, and then other parts were fitted to the car to make up the PI. I was trying to keep it as close as possible between the 2 vehicles. Now, this isn't necessarily the very fastest way to build a car, but it was to try and keep everything fair between the 2 of them. And with a Ferrari, we got an interesting result. When the car was put together, the turbo car had 702 horsepower, which is quite a lot of horsepower for an A-class car. It's actually quite a nice car to drive as well, considering all of the power that we got from it. Whereas the Supercharger had 721. So while the Supercharger itself wasn't making as much power, because it was a lower PI, I could put more parts on the car and get more horsepower out of the engine. I also got more torque. Admittedly, there's only 6 more torque from the Supercharger at 544 instead of 538, but still, there was more torque from the supercharged car. However, it did weigh a little bit more. It was about 40 pounds heavier, with 3,017 pounds for the supercharged car. So more power, more torque, but a little bit more weight. I drove 5 laps around the Catalonia National Track with both cars, and the supercharged car, went faster, a 1:17.3 compared to a 1:18.1. That's quite a big difference as well. That's getting on for a second quicker for the supercharged vehicle. Not quite the result that I was necessarily expecting. Now I tried to keep things, I tried to have a good mixture of cars, different drive lines, or modern and older cars. So up next, a 4-wheel drive Audi saloon car, the Audi RS4. I quite like this car. It's a lovely, easy and safe to drive 4-wheel drive car. I have to say, I was really impressed with how well the Ferrari managed its 700 horsepower. It was remarkably easy to drive for a big rear-wheel drive, scary Italian supercar. The Audi, of course, you know, there's no real problems with this car. It's big. It's actually, I was amazed how light this car was. It was the same weight as the Testarossa, pretty much. I didn't expect it to, with the weight reduction, to be as light as the Ferrari. Yeah, but it's a big, safe 4-wheel drive car. Again, it's a similar story when it comes to the differences between the pair of them. The supercharged car, 8 horsepower more, 6 more torques, and is a little bit heavier than the turboed version of the vehicle. So again, the supercharger is getting a little bit more out of the vehicle, and when we come to the lap times, it's a similar story. A 1:17.5 from the supercharger, a 17.9 from the turbo. And there isn't a huge amount of difference between these two cars. It's certainly not as big a gap between the figures as we got with the Ferrari, and it's not as big a gap as we got with the lap time either. And both of the cars were very easy to drive around this track. You get a bit of understeer from the Audi, as you would expect from a big 4-wheel drive car. But yeah, both of these cars, both of the versions of it were very easy to drive and very similar. Up next, the Alfa Gtv. Now, this was not easy to drive. This one being in C-Class. This was incredibly oversteery. It was a very slidey car that I did have a little bit of problems when it came to the driving. Again, the supercharged car was a little bit more powerful, 278 horsepower to 275, but I mean, that's not a very big gap. We get more torque from the turbo engine, 248 to the supercharged 237. Again, we're not talking about huge difference, and there's only 6 pounds of weight difference. They're both around 2,300 pounds. So it's a lightweight car it hasn't got a huge amount of power, to be honest. But I really struggled with this car. Now, as I said, the cars had race tyres, so they didn't have fully upgraded tyre widths on them. And I'm guessing that was a small problem for the Alfa. That's very sideways around the final corner. Yeah, I certainly struggled with both of these cars. They were both very slidey. Certainly not my sort of vehicle. And when it comes to the times, it was 1:24.5 from the turboed car, but a 1:24.8 from the supercharged. So it was the first car in which the turbo went a little bit quicker. Yeah, I've got things very wrong. Yeah, we have one victory for the turbocharger in this one. Yeah, it was a tough car to drive, and that kind of got me thinking. I was wondering if having like a car with less grip was that going to be a thing in the results. Our next car, though, we are back to a classic muscle car, an Amc Javelin. This is the only vehicle out of the 6 that I used in which the turbo got more power. 499 horsepower from the turboed car, 495 from the supercharged. Again, we're not looking at a particularly big difference. 600 torques from the turboed one, 595 from the supercharged. Still not particularly much. This time around, though, the supercharger is lighter. 2,762 pounds for the supercharged car, 2,789 from the turbo. So a little bit different on this one. I'm not entirely sure what it is. I'm not entirely sure why that is. But the supercharged was a little bit down on power comparatively, but it was a lighter car. Now I was thinking perhaps that this was going to be a little bit more of a difficult car to drive. I mean, it's a classic muscle car, but in all honesty, this was much easier to get around the track than the Alfa Romeo. Much nicer to drive. I'm thinking that because from standard it probably had slightly larger rear tyres, meant putting the power down a little bit easier. This AMC is a B-class car, whereas the Alfa was a C-class, and Alfa spent all its time sideways, and the classic muscle car was pretty nice to drive. When it comes to the lap times, a 1:22.4 from the supercharged car, a 23.3 from the turbo. So again, almost a second difference between these two. And I can't, for the life of me, figure out quite why. Perhaps the gear ratio suited the Supercharger a little bit better. I'm pretty sure that it had a racing gearbox on it. That's my best guess as to why there's such a big difference in times for that particular car. Because otherwise, you know, there's not a huge difference in the statistics of them. Our next vehicle, front-wheel drive car. This time around, a Fiat Punto. This was again in B class. This was quite a powerful one for a front-wheel drive car. With the Supercharger, 344 horsepower. That's a lot of power going through the front wheels. It's perfectly manageable. I mean, I had an Astra up to about 600 horsepower through the front wheels, and it could be driven, but of course this much power front-wheel drive is not ideal. It had 25 more horsepower for the Supercharger over the turbo car. However, we had more torque from the turbo vehicle. Only 4, it's 224 for the turbo, 220 for the Supercharger, and the turbo was again a little bit lighter. Yeah, I mean, not an easy car to drive, the Punto. When you've got this much power going through, I don't think it has quite as nice a chassis as the Astra VXR had when I did the front-wheel drive test. It's a little bit difficult to drive. You've got a lot of understeer, and you've also got a lot of wheel spin if you aren't careful. And when we look at the times, it is the turbo that goes quicker, a 122.4 to the supercharged 22.7. It's pretty close between the pair of them, but again, it's another victory for the turbo, and it was still carrying on my thought of, is the fact that the car is being harder to drive, is having less grip, you're getting more wheel spin from it. Is that a factor? Is that why the turbos... I mean, the two cars that the turbos were going quicker were cars that I didn't really like to drive, so I tried to build up another car that would be difficult to drive. Got a Fiat X1-9 with 580 plus horsepower for both of these, so an awful lot of power in this car. Again with racing tyres and tiny rear wheels. The standard car, I think it's 185 rear tyres on this Fiat. I was thinking this was going to be very difficult to drive. It's an A-class car. It accelerates like mad. It's doing 175 before I have to jump on the brakes into turn 1. Doesn't stop very well, but dear God does it accelerate fast. Quite a crazy car. Amazingly, it isn't that oversteering. I mean, it's not the nicest car I had to drive, certainly, but it wasn't as slidey and terrifying as I expected from it. Again, another car in which the Supercharger was more powerful, 586 compared to 582. However, we get a lot more torque out of the turbo, 451 to 412, and the Supercharger is lighter by about 30 pounds. I mean, this car's 2,136 pounds for the Supercharger one. It's a light car with an awful lot of power, and surprisingly controllable. I have to say, I really thought this would be floundering around all over the place, but it actually wasn't. When it comes to the times, well, it's near enough identical between the two cars. An 18.732 for the turbo and 18.707 for the Supercharger. So yeah, I mean, that's practically identical lap times. Yeah, I'm not a machine. I mean, anything sort of under half a second difference between times could well be down to down to driving. To be perfectly fair, I'm not a complete robot when it comes to this. So as far as the conclusions go, well, there is no great big huge obvious pattern of one is massively faster than the other. That's just not the case. What patterns we do see is, well, 5 out of 6 times the Supercharger has been the more powerful of the two options. It's more of a 50-50 split between torque and weight. In general, the more powerful the torquier car is, the heavier of the two. I think, but we never really got sort of a huge gap. We never really got more than sort of 25 horsepower difference. I think the Fiat was the biggest torque difference, and that was sort of almost 40 odd. But we never had really huge differences between the two cars. And when it came to lap times, I mean, it was still fairly close. A lot of them were within half a second of each other, with only the Ferrari and AMC being noticeably, sort of a noticeable significant difference between the pair of them. So yeah, what can we say? Well, definitely don't discount a Supercharger. Certainly if you're building up a car, definitely don't discount it. 4 out of 6 times it was quicker around here, although it wasn't by a huge margin. It wasn't by a particularly sizable one. What I would tend to say is that potentially with the harder to drive cars, the turbo seemed to be, the turbo was the quicker option. It got a faster lap time with the two cars that were more difficult to drive. The Fiat that was kind of in the middle, it was a little bit difficult, but it wasn't terrible to drive. The times were near identical, and the cars that were quite nice and easy to drive, the Ferrari, the Audi, the Javelin and so on, the times were a bit quicker for the Supercharger. So yeah, if you've got a bit of a pain in the ass car, then I would perhaps recommend you go with the turbo. If you've got a lovely easy car to drive, then maybe a Supercharger is a little bit better option. Of course, it's going to vary from car to car, and yeah, there's many cars to choose from. So yeah, there isn't a huge difference in the two, but there is some things to take into consideration. Anyway, that's it for this video, guys. So thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.